Good morning and welcome to the City of Bowie Fair Housing Training for Spring 2021. We're going to give everyone a minute to log on and then we will be getting started with the presentation. Thank you for joining us this morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just waiting a minute to give everyone a chance to log on. This is the Fair Housing Training presented by the City of Bowie Office of Grant Development and Administration in collaboration with Manuel Ochoa of Ochoa Urban Collaborative. If you have any questions for us, feel free to raise your hand. We'll unmute you, or you can type it into the Q&A. We're going to start in just a few seconds. Give everyone a chance to log on. All right, we're going to get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is the Spring 2021 Fair Housing Training presented by the City of Bowie, Office of Grant Development and Administration, and Manuel Ochoa of the Ochoa Urban Collaborative. The City of Bowie Office of Grant Development and Administration is responsible for managing grant funds on behalf of the City of Bowie, including community development block grant funds from HUD. We use those funds for a number of purposes, including fair housing training for City of Bowie employees, members of the public, and people in Prince George's County who want to learn more about fair housing. If you have any questions, you can email us at bowiehsg@cityofbowie.org, or you can go to our website, cityofbowie.org/fairhousing, for more fair housing information and resources. My name is Kay Starr. I'm the program coordinator for the Grants Office, and with us today is also Jesse Buggs, who is the director. This is the agenda for this morning. We're going to start with an introduction and welcome by Mr. Jesse Buggs, followed by the presentation by Manuel Ochoa. We then will have a short break and conclude with a wrap up and Q&A. As always, anyone who has questions, please raise your hand or type it in the Q&A and we will address it. Just a little bit about Manuel. He is the principal and founder of Ochoa Urban Collaborative, which is a planning, community, and economic development firm with equity lens that provides strategy, policy, and implementation services to help people, neighborhoods, and communities revitalize and thrive. And with that, I am going to stop my screen share and turn it over to Mr. Jesse Buggs to do the introduction.
Good morning. We want to obviously welcome you. Seems that we have a few more people joining. That is great. Good morning. We want to welcome you to the City of Bowie's Fair Housing Symposium for 2021. HUD's theme for 2021 is Fair Housing, More Than Just Words. Today, we intend to amplify that theme and provide some context and useful practical information on its purpose and ultimate goals and objectives. We have a diverse group with us today. We have state legislators, realtors, property managers, code enforcement officers, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Housing Director, local policymakers, and others. We also have a very knowledgeable speaker, Manuel Ochoa, founder and principal of Ochoa Urban Collaborative. Manuel is a former undersecretary of HUD and a trusted colleague. Several months ago, Manuel and his team completed the 2020 to 2025 analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, which we refer to as the AI, for Prince George's County and the City of Bowie. He is currently working with the Lawyers Committee for Equal Rights Under Law and the Urban Institute to conduct the new 5-year AI for the COG region. We thank you again for attending today's symposium, and now we'll turn things over to Manuel for him to continue his presentation. Let me ask you a moment, Kay, did you want to do the poll now, or should we have Manuel just okay, well, Kay will now conduct a brief poll. Thank you.
We're going to launch a really quick poll for you guys just to gauge everyone's knowledge of fair housing. It's a very easy multiple choice. Just select what best describes your level of fair housing knowledge, and then we will continue with the presentation.
And in the meantime, I'll just say welcome to everyone, and thank you, Kay, for running the poll, and thank you, Jesse, for the kind introduction. Looking forward to sharing with you some updates and some background on fair housing
So,
in conjunction with Fair Housing Month.
sorry, looks like everyone has voted. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results with everybody. So it looks like people either this is mostly your first training or you've done it a few times before.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you for doing that, Kate. Gives me a little bit of an idea about who's here. And I think I have a little bit, some flavor for everyone. And what I'm going to do, there's a lot of material that I'm going to cover today. So I will stop for questions, breaks along the way. So if you want to share or you have any comments or you have any questions, we would certainly love that. I don't want to just speak at you for 15 minutes. I hope to make it interactive. So if you have some questions, we would welcome that. So we're here because it's Fair Housing Month. So this is always a good opportunity to remember this important piece of civil rights legislation. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. It's the last chapter in landmark civil rights legislation that started with voting rights legislation and other civil rights legislation in 1964. It immediately nullified thousands of racially restrictive covenants across the country. We'll talk about that in more detail, but basically restrictive covenants on property prevented African Americans, Latinos, and other minorities from living in certain neighborhoods. And there are a couple of architects, and one of the key architects is Dr. Martin Luther King. And in fact, toward the end of, or before he was assassinated, Dr. King was actually in Chicago, and he led several efforts to highlight the terrible housing conditions in Chicago and other places around the country. So part of his movement also included housing. And so fair housing was something that was key and important to what he was doing. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 4th, 1968. And he, after a few days after that, and this had been, which by the way, the Fair Housing Act had been very controversial, had already been introduced numerous times, but it was stuck in legislation. So unfortunately, it took the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King to pass it into law. And the two key architects for the Fair Housing Act, you'll see on the desk, of course, President Johnson. If you look on your screen to your left, standing right there is Senator Edward Brooke, who was one of the main sponsors of the legislation. And to your right, looking down, is you might recognize Senator Mondale, who just passed away, who was a vice president. And I think it says a lot about the man, and I think is very appropriate for Fair Housing Month. His family released a statement sharing that for President Mondale, that the passage of the Fair Housing Act was one of the highlights of his career and one of the most hard fought. So what are the fair housing rights? Many of you are familiar with this portion of the Fair Housing Act, that it protects persons who are trying to buy or rent a home because of either a disability, race, sex, color, national origin, religion, and family status. And in the fair housing terminology, these are called protected classes. And so, basically, these are the groups of people that are protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And there are others that there may be additional protections based on local and state legislation, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so here are some examples of what it addresses. So under most housing situations, the Fair Housing Act protects most housing situations, such as the refusal to rent or buy a home, make housing unavailable or a dwelling, falsely deny housing for inspection or sale or rental, persuade the owners to sell or rent for a profit, blockbusting, deny access or membership to a facility, And the same thing also applies in mortgage lending. And a lot of this might have to do with, for example, interest rates that were offered to one group and not to another group, or discrimination in appraisals. You might have heard in the past few weeks that there was a situation in California where the appraisal came in low for an African-American family in a very nice neighborhood, and then it came in low, and then some friends of theirs who were white went again, and the appraisal came in much higher. So these are still things that are still ongoing, which is why the Fair Housing Act is important. And we don't hear a lot about, we don't hear about maybe threaten or coercion or intimidation, but it is happening. And I would say that especially with the pandemic, there have been lots of stories of coercion and intimidation around the rental of homes. So Fair Housing Act is very relevant today. There are some exceptions, however. For units, owner-occupied units with less than 4 units may be exempted. There are lots of different details to that, but primarily that is one general exception. Single-family housing, sold or rented without a broker, might also be exempt. Senior housing, I've gotten this question before because elderly, like for example, the elderly Section 202 HUD programs are exclusively for seniors. That is allowed under the Fair Housing Act. And then housing operated by private clubs and member organizations are also exempt. It's also important to note that there are several laws and regulations and executive orders. I won't go into detail of those rules and regulations today, but there are many of them that we should be aware of. But primarily, they are an umbrella. They protect persons with disabilities. For example, in the refuse or deny reasonable modifications to a housing unit at the disabled person's expense. So, for example, a disabled person who wants to add a grab bar to a bathroom, if they pay for it, the owner, that is considered a reasonable accommodation that should be allowed. Refuse to make reasonable accommodations in rules, policies, or practices or services for persons with disabilities in the use of housing. So if there are some rules, some rules, for example, about, for example, say a mailbox in a building, about how that gets, if a person needs assistance with that, if it's reasonable to get their mail because they can't reach it, and so maybe the front desk person, that might be a reasonable accommodation. And then there are also several regulations and laws related to universal design to make units more accessible, or what they call visitable, for persons with disabilities. This is also important to note that there's been a lot going on since President Biden took office related to fair housing and racial equity issues. Specifically for HUD, Secretary Fudge announced that HUD is withdrawing the proposed rule to weaken the equal access rule. This was a rule that was passed under the previous administration that made it weaker, that weakened the rule around gender identity, and so this affirms that gender identity is protected under the Fair Housing Act, and affirms that it is considered part of sex as a protected class. As you saw previously, sex is a protected class. The previous administration was trying to weaken the link between gender identity and those who consider themselves non-binary and could be subject to discrimination in housing. Secretary Fudge wanted to make sure that this was clarified and strengthen it once again, that meets the spirit of the equal access rule. So the equal access rule ensures that all individuals, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, have equal access to the department's Office of Community Development programs, shelters, buildings, facilities, benefits, etc. So for example, these could be homeless shelters, these could be units funded under the home program, anything like that, or CDBG, they are protected under the equal access rule. And then locally, we have also a couple of developments. And in fact, in this region, we've had lots of developments around fair housing and protected classes. So last year, Prince George's County enacted the Council Bill CB 38, which established the county's policies ensuring equal opportunity and eliminating discrimination in all housing accommodations and a source of income. Virginia also passed a companion legislation. And then it's also important to note that just recently, in this past March, the Maryland General Assembly passed the Home Opportunities Made Equal Act, which prevents source of income discrimination statewide. So what is that? That's because commonly, unfortunately, people with housing choice vouchers might not have all the units available to them. Many have been told, have been turned away. And so they've been unable to use their voucher in the unit that they've selected. And so now this bans that kind of discrimination. Or for that matter, it also prevents the discrimination from other kinds of grants that maybe a local government might provide to subsidize housing. So I'm going to just stop for a moment and see, Kay, do we have any questions in the chat or anything related to just the first portion about housing discrimination?
No questions or comments so far, but
okay,
type something in the chat, even if you just have learned something you didn't know before.
Yep, that'd be great. And so there's two parts to the Fair Housing Act. So I told you about the first part, which is the more commonly known part of the Fair Housing Act. The second part is known as affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this is an obligation for local governments who receive HUD funds. They're referred to as entitlement communities if they receive community development block grant directly, or state funds. And so some of those funds may also include Home Investment Partnerships Program or Emergency Solutions Grants, which are used to fund a lot of programs for the homeless. And under the Fair Housing Act, and also the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, which is how the CDBG program was created, it requires any community that receives funding to affirmatively further fair housing. So this requirement means that all jurisdictions are required to complete an analysis of impediments to fair housing, which I'll talk about later. But going back to that about affirmatively furthering fair housing, what it basically means, the whole idea is the federal government, it's giving its funds to localities. The intent of the Fair Housing Act was also to help integration along, and that federal funds would not be used to block or further any other forms of segregation or discrimination locally using federal funds. Therefore, the local governments are supposed to show how they're leveraging those funds to make sure that those barriers that exist so that people can choose their housing in a fair manner across their city, state, or region affirmatively furthers the Fair Housing Act. And as part of that process, for example, when the city of Bowie and Prince George's County completed their AI process, they're required to certify. So there's a certification after they do all the analysis that takes place and the focus groups, and they come up with their goals and actions. Each jurisdiction, in this case, Prince George's County and the city of Bowie that just completed their analysis of impediments to fair housing, they have to certify that they have analyzed housing discrimination and working toward its elimination, that they are promoting fair housing for all. They are providing ways so that they can provide racially and ethnically inclusive patterns of housing, promoted accessible and usable units to persons with disabilities, and promoted and enforced the Fair Housing Act and related laws. So now I'm going to go backwards in time. So why did Congress pass the Fair Housing Act? Well, there is a long history of racial discrimination in our country that has affected land patterns to this day. And there are all sorts of examples. And I'm just going to go through a few. We can go all the way back in time to the time of the Civil War. You've probably heard of the, it's become almost a mythical, legendary, the 40 acres and a mule, and that has a basis in history, because right after the Civil War, General Sherman actually provided confiscated land to freed slaves to farm, and the whole idea was to help them start to become economically self-sufficient and be able to farm the land, which they knew how to do. Unfortunately, that was reversed. And to your right, I have a picture that I found from the New York Times, because we've also heard a lot recently about the black farmer and discrimination that has taken place in access to loans. And I mentioned that because we think about housing, but housing is also tied to land and also to wealth building. So I think this goes, all the way back, and even today, as part of the most recent the rescue plan, there's actually funding in there for African American farmers. I think it is, if I remember correctly, almost 95%. So if you count like black farmers, how much property they had 100 years ago, almost 95% of that has been lost. I also wanted to show some local, some also local examples too. We think about these things as having taken place in the past and maybe having taken place someplace else. So when we look at these pictures, it's shocking to me to see them, even though you know the history, but there's like a picture says 1,000 words. And you can see this in and here on the left, you see an example of an ad about, attention white home buyers, the largest restricted white community in Washington, invites your attention to the decision of the Supreme Court that blacks, I don't want to say the word, cannot buy in a restricted white section in Eckington, Bloomingdale, and this is in Washington, D.C., to buy or rent. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court at the time actually affirmed the right to use restrictive covenants, which is why passing the Fair Housing Act was so important. So we're talking about something these court cases happen in the 19 teens and 20s. And so all the way until the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that completely nullified these restrictive covenants, but they happen all over, all over the region in different places. And you even see this ad, which is also, again, for, maybe some of you who are real estate agents. I know many of brokers, they have to take training on fair housing. And again, something that you think about from in the past, but, we were all, so not to just point out just real estate agents, but, this was across the board in all sectors of society. And in this case, you can see in the Code of Ethics for the Washington real estate that it actually said that no property in a white section should ever be sold, rented, or advertised, or offered to colored people. And there is also government-sponsored segregation. So the federal government, after, especially in the 1930s, with the creation of the FHA, the Federal Home Mortgage Administration, they actually sponsored, they helped to support the developments all across the country and help spur the growth of the suburbs. It comes to find out that they actually didn't loan everywhere, and they created redlining maps. But I wanted to stop here to show this picture. So I'm sure Mr. Bugs and Kay may recognize this is actually a picture of what was known as Bel Air, which would be Bowie today, which is the part of the Levittown. And I remember from some time ago having talked to Jesse about the Levittown and in Bowie, and I went back to read a couple of nights ago on Bel Air, and apparently Mr. Levitt, who had developments all across the country, and they were restricted to whites only, they went to the mat on trying to keep Bel Air or Bowie, this part of Bowie, segregated. So he went to the mat and he was in the papers, and this was in the 1960s. And here's some examples of redlining maps. Again, this is one of those things that maybe you heard the term redlining and you thought maybe it was a figurative term. It's actually a literal, and you can see the actual red on the map of the right, which is in Chicago. To the left, you'll see the maps of Washington, D.C., and you can actually see parts of Prince George's County in that map. And they used to rate sections from A to F, and F being the areas where the FHA did not recommend that the federal government should provide loans. So in that case, it also influenced what banks did and private developers. So therefore, no loans were offered in these areas. And today, we can even take some of those maps and we can overlay them with maps where there's concentrated poverty, and you'll see a match. So these land patterns that were established long ago are still, unfortunately, with us today. And the terrible thing about it is, people have tried to do research. They have found these maps for a long time that were hidden in the, in the National Archives. People couldn't find them. I think some pages are missing. People cannot find all the maps. So this is one of the few maps that is available for Washington, D.C. And in the guidebook, there's also no real explanation to prove or to establish what's the evidence to say why loans should not be, why there shouldn't be investments in certain neighborhoods, in African American neighborhoods. What would actually lead them to believe that there would actually be any evidence of any decrease in the investment? There's no proof of that. There was also urban renewal across the country. In fact, one of the earliest areas of urban renewal of neighborhoods that were raised, this is Southwest DC, actually where the Department of Housing and Urban Development sits today. If you look on the picture to the right, you might be able to see where some of that is, where some of that construction is taking place, the type of development that took place, where things were raised. On the left is what the neighborhood used to look like, which was actually a very thriving African-American and mixed immigrant community in Southwest, and it was torn down by the freeway. There are also examples of what I call a lost African-American community. So these were communities that existed. On the left is one, this is a picture from 1968 in Scotland, Maryland, which is in Montgomery County. And on the right, this was actually known as the Magruder Plantation, which is where the Westbard Montgomery Mall sits today. And there are other examples. And this one is actually close to me in my neighborhood. I live in the Friendship Heights neighborhood of near Bethesda and Chevy Chase. And the Macedonia Baptist Church just celebrated 100 years. This is the last remaining piece of what used to be an African-American neighborhood. And they've been in there's been a huge controversy in the neighborhood because of an African-American cemetery that was literally paved over. And you can see the building on the right, which is a high-rise building in the shadow of the Macedonia Baptist Church. And that building on the right actually took out several homes, which were part of the neighborhood. It included a school. It was a whole community that was there. And you've also read about the Georgetown Descendants, and Georgetown University has been through a whole process when over 272 enslaved men, women, and children were sold from Southern Maryland to Louisiana to help pay for the debts of Georgetown University, which is a very, very terrible part of our history. And it's important that these kinds of conversations are happening today. So, and how does all of this, what does that mean for today? Well, you can still see the effects of the lack of the opportunity for wealth building for many African-American families because of all these things that have happened over the years. In 2019, the median wealth without counting pensions of Black households in the United States was 24,100, compared with 189,000 for white households. The typical Black household had 12.7% of the wealth of the typical white household, and they owned 165,000 less in wealth. You can see the average household compared in 2019 versus the average household. The gap is huge. So on average, Black households had 14.5% of the wealth of white households, with an absolute dollar gap of 838,000. And I just kind of think about the, what's happened in Westbard and in other communities across the country where African Americans and other minorities were pushed out of a neighborhood. And so they lost that opportunity to be able to pass on that wealth to their other family members, which is part of the American dream today, which is how, that's how many people in our nation have been able to succeed economically. And one of the things that I find interesting too is that there are studies that have shown that it actually doesn't take a lot of money, and but $1,000 to for school or or for a home can make a big difference. And there are a lot of families that don't have that opportunity. I also, if you're interested in learning more, I just also wanted to stop here. There's a lot of history that I threw at you. I'm a big history buff, as you can see, but I think that, understanding where we are today, it's important to understand the past. I highly recommend this video, which is called Segregated by Design. It's an award-winning video. It's at segregatedbydesign.com. It is based on the book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It really lays out in more detail than what I've given you today, but I think it's important to understand that, I think in this conversation that it can get kind of heated, that there shouldn't really, it's not necessarily about like finger pointing or taking personal, that there's specific blame on specific people. This is a history, part of the history of our nation, and we're all responsible for finding a solution for it. So I highly recommend, as he says here, if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. So I'm just going to stop right there for a moment. Kay, are there any questions or comments? Or Jesse, is there any a question or comments that you wanted to add about some of the historical background or anything that I might have missed?
Nothing in the
No,
chat.
Manuel, I do want to say that I'm glad that you brought the map of the Bel Air community and made that a part of your presentation today, because as late as last week, there are some members of our community who want to put up major signs in the middle, right on 450 in the heart of the city, to glorify 60 years of the Levittown community. So the city manager and council are having to wrestle with these issues even as you make your presentation. So I thank you for that.
Oh my goodness, wow, very timely. Well, I would point, if you're interested, if you're from Bowie, there is a website also called the DC Prologue, and they've been gathering a lot of information on the history. There is a whole page, and I'll try to see if I can find it for you, Jesse, if you haven't seen it already, that lays out the whole history of Mr. Levitt, and specifically, which is what was shocking to me, is I knew that Bowie was a Levittown, that and there was actually a not a Supreme Court case, but there is a famous case of a family, and I have it written down, a couple that actually went to and what they did is an early version of testing. And they went to he worked for the Office of the Budget, which is today the Office of Management and Budget. Young couple, they went to the sales office for the Levittown. They were turned away because they were told that they would not sell specifically to African Americans. And there was a group called CORE, which some of you may have heard about. This was the organization that helped to organize the freedom rides in the South. And they followed up on making sure. So all of that led to the eventual integration in Bowie, but it was hard fought. This is not something that just happened overnight or simply that it was a simple and easy process. It was not. It was hard fought. So I like to pick this the ping pong, because there have been many changes that have been hard to keep up with. So you've been following fair housing for a few years. There's been a lot of back and forth. So to try to keep it all organized and where we've been and where we are going. So one of the things to think about too is what is this concept of disparate impact? And actually I have these two slides backwards, so I'm going to go forward here. So disparate impact is not mentioned in the Fair Housing Act, but it has been used to argue discrimination. It started in employment law, and then it was used for fair housing cases whereby when there aren't direct forms of discrimination, but may have the same effect by unintentionally impacting minorities. So what's the difference? It's like a fancy word for basically with that example that I gave you of this couple, and I'll have to find that in the thing, but let's call them Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And they go to the Levittown and they want to buy a home, and they're told outright, we don't rent to Black couples. Straight out. That is direct form of discrimination. However, nowadays, there are other forms of discrimination that aren't so apparent. So for example, credit scores, or maybe like other practices related to, for example, loans, mortgages. That's been a big case on how those algorithms are being used to process mortgages. So maybe it's apparently that it looks like this is something that is neutral across the board, but in fact, it's actually discriminatory because it highly impacts a certain group of minorities more than others. So there have been cases around the country. It went to 10 appellate courts, and it wasn't until 2015 that a Supreme Court case in Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities Project that it finally went to the Supreme Court. And some other examples of what disparate impact looks like. This report by the Center for Responsible Lending that's called Lost Ground, that I highly recommend it if you are interested. It was published in 2011. It was groundbreaking because they took home disclosure mortgage information from thousands and thousands of loans all across the country. And they were able to show that African Americans and Latinos were more likely to receive a high cost mortgage with risky features. And even when they controlled, so even when there was an African American family or Latino family with a good credit score, and in this case at the time it was like 660, they were still more likely to receive a high cost loan than their white counterparts. So as a result, 25% of African Americans and Latinos lost their homes. And one, ground zero for that was Prince George's County. So I can remember I worked as a housing counseling director in Washington, D.C. and in Montgomery County, and meeting with colleagues. And of course, that made national headlines about what was happening in the suburban communities around Prince George's County, where hundreds of homes were lost because they got into risky loans. And I mentioned credit scores that disproportionately affect borrowers. This has been a conversation for many years now because certain kinds of rents weren't counted. So if you weren't one of these just a few years ago, if you weren't renting from one of those large companies that own property across the country, it would be hard to show, even if you were paying on time monthly to your landlord, it might not get counted positively. And so the credit scores were lower than for those who might have like a mortgage or some other conventional rental apartment. So what happened in this case? It finally went to the Supreme Court. And by the way, there were several tries. So there were several attempts to make it to the Supreme Court. And it wasn't until the Texas case made it. And in July 2015, they ruled in favor that disparate impact could be used as a legal remedy in fair housing cases in a 5-4 decision. And Justice Kennedy stated that for the majority, that even though the Fair Housing Act does not decree a particular vision of urban development, and it does not put authorities and private developers in a double bind of liability, subject to suit on whether they choose to rejuvenate a city core or to promote new low-income housing in suburban communities. So why is this important? Because actually that case had to do with where low-income housing tax credit properties were located. And what the Inclusive Communities Project was trying to show is that there was a preponderance or majority of tax credit properties that were being located in areas of concentrated poverty and not in areas of opportunity. So I think the two big takeaways, there were a couple of big takeaways from this case, is that yes, disparate impact can be used as a legal remedy, but then on this case about where to place housing, especially government-sponsored workforce housing or affordable housing, that they leave it up to the local government on whether they choose between mobility, housing preservation, or revitalization, because those local conditions and the history of each place is different, that the federal government shouldn't second guess a local government's decision, as long as it's still trying to further fair housing. So, and then there's also this false choice, which has been an argument between choosing to invest between distressed communities and communities of opportunity. And I know there's a lot of conversation out there, even to this day, it's it's annually on what happens in the budget, in a local government budget, but you really have to do both. You shouldn't have to choose and think that one remedy in just investing in distressed communities is the best way, rather than communities of opportunity. You should be able to do both, and the circumstances change depending on what your community looks like. So related to that, so we have on the one hand, if you follow me, we have the Supreme Court case, and then you have the rule that was passed in 2013. So believe it or not, even though disparate impact had been used in employment law and other kinds of law, it actually at HUD, the department had never actually published a disparate impact standard until 2013. So finally in 2013, and their housing advocates and fair housing advocates, civil rights advocates were pushing HUD, especially in the light of the upcoming Supreme Court case, that there would be a big hole if after all of this argument back and forth, and we're arguing a housing case, and yet the Supreme Court would turn to HUD and say, like, wait a minute, you guys don't have a standard. So HUD passed a standard that outlined all the steps and all the tests on how a disparate impact case would be adjudicated by HUD. And then in September 2020, under the previous administration, the disparate impact rule was removed. So now HUD was left back at square one. And again, going back to that example of the ping pong, so what do we have like back then? Well, the affirmatively furthering housing rule then related to the Fair Housing Act, the plans that local jurisdictions sent to HUD were primarily unenforced since the 1990s. And there were few standards about what actually had to be included in the analysis of impediments. And there were just variations across the country about what that looked like. But then they would go to HUD and they wouldn't go anywhere. So the Government Accountability Office wrote a scathing report in 2010 that basically was saying that HUD was not enforcing the Fair Housing Act and that the AI was not effective. And they talked to local governments, a lot of local governments across the country were actually frustrated. So they felt like, we're going through all this trouble, HUD is not really utilizing it or using or enforcing it, except in some very rare, egregious cases. And so in 2015, HUD published new regulations, tools, and maps, and an outline, and that is known as the Assessment of Fair Housing. Previously the Trump administration took down the AFH, the Assessment for Fair Housing Rule. And then again, going back to the example of this ping pong, you have President Biden who signed 4 executive orders 6 days into office around racial equity and specifically related to HUD, a memorandum redressing our nation and our federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. So that led to Secretary Fudge stating that HUD plans to reinstate the 2015 affirmatively further fair housing rule and the 2013 disparate impact regulations. So the 2015 rule and the 2013 disparate impact regulations. So this was just recently. This is hot off the press. It's also important to note too that given where we are with a pandemic, that there has been a lot of activity about related to rental evictions across the country. The Centers for Disease Control issued an unprecedented eviction moratorium in September 2020. And this is the first of its kind of a nationwide moratorium on eviction. This has never happened before. And the whole idea was if the federal government and public health authorities are telling people that they should socially distance, and that and you have families that might be who are evicted, who are searching for a home or could be homeless or could be put in a group home situation because they've been evicted, that could subject them to being exposed to the coronavirus. So that was the rationale behind the creation of the moratorium. You've probably seen in the news, this moratorium has been extended numerous times. It has now been extended through June 30th, 2021. There have been a lot of tricky situations, so it's really not cut and dry. So if you're working in the housing world, you've been following this very closely. If you're not, it can be kind of confusing. But I would say that the most important things are that there are protections for non-payment that are more clear from April 2020 forward. Unfortunately, there were some burdens that were created in the previous administration where renters had to prove that they were being harmed. Those burdens have been taken away, although there are still many cases proceeding forward around the country because of their differing court interpretations. And in fact, many cases have gone to even federal district court. So it's not very clear. So the administration has tried to clarify some of those questions. So really, if you know of anyone who is being bullied or pushed or evicted, that they should turn to legal aid and get legal assistance, because in most cases they should not be evicted from their home because of the pandemic. There are exceptions related to criminal activity and things like that, but for the most part, people should be able to stay in their home. And in fact, now that we have passed the American Rescue Plan, there are billions of dollars in rent. So all these things are connected again. So remember, I mentioned earlier, source of income discrimination. So someone who receives the funding to pay their back rent from their American Rescue Plan, they are protected from eviction. There should be sufficient time for them to receive this assistance to pay their back rent. And the landlord should accept this funding from the local government that comes from the American Rescue Plan to make sure that they are whole. So there's a lot of examples of tricky business going on around there where landlords have refused those payments. Those are likely to be extended in court. So if you know of any cases like that, either personally in your life from people that you know, make sure that they get legal assistance and legal aid. For example, Maryland legal aid is excellent source of help and information. So y'all remember the movie The Money Pit? So I'm probably like the rest, like everyone, we've been in our home for all year and looking around and finding all of the defects in our homes. So, I'm looking at all these projects that I'd like to do. We'll see if we do that. But it just reminded me of the money pit, and the house kind of falling in. But it also like, well, what does that have to do with fair housing? Well, and all this history that I've given you. Well, it's you can think of our nation as like our home, and yes, it's got all its problems and all its defects, but it's our home, and we need to fix it up, right? We don't have the luxury of turning the other way and not repairing the roof or the leaky faucet, because as we know, a leaky faucet can cause a flood in our home, and so that's basically how I like to think about this, as a good metaphor for just taking care of our nation's business related to racial equity and justice. So, and related to that, really, the analysis of impediments is just a tool for doing that. So it provides the opportunity to look at the patterns of residential segregation and the incidence of housing discrimination, and what the remedies can be to improve housing choice. You also may have heard it being called a fair housing plan or an assessment of fair housing. And you heard Jesse mention that the Prince George's County and the city of Bowie published their analysis of impediments to fair housing choice last year. And now this region is starting on the path of a regional AI. And we know, intuitively, right? Things don't stop at the Prince George's County border or the city of Bowie border, right? All these issues related to housing choice are common issues that we share across the region. We know that in the past, there are not any lengthy commutes today, but we know that in the past there were lengthy commutes and people living further and further out because of limited housing choices. Areas of concentrated poverty with underperforming schools, low-income areas that were located in proximity to brownfields or areas that were contaminated, limited access to or limited number of accessible units for persons with disability, and then the lack of affordable housing in areas of high opportunity with good schools and quality of life. I can just shared with you earlier in my neighborhood in Friendship Heights and Westbard, part of that whole discussion or going on also has to do with a redevelopment that includes affordable housing units. So there are people all up in arms. So we hear about, not in my backyard. And we need to solve for that so that everyone can have the same opportunity for good schools. I like this picture. I used to work with enterprise community partners. We think about it as a continuum. We always talk about housing, but housing is interconnected, as I was just talking about, with transit, a healthy environment, public safety, jobs, all of these things like fit together about how we live in community. So we can't just address the housing issue without touching on some of these other issues because they're interrelated. And that's really what I like about the assessment of fair housing, is that it looks at things in a more holistic fashion. Y'all might have seen some of these signs. I was looking around and remembered about the maglev. There's been a lot of in Greenbelt area, and I know some of the council members have been very active about the construction of the underground train between DC and Baltimore. And this is actually an environmental justice issue because it's affecting housing all underneath the corridor, and there's no stop in Prince George's County, by the way, which I think is interesting. I don't know how this will result, but this is the kind of issue where maybe you think it might see this and it's like, well, what does that have to do with housing? It's a transportation issue, but it goes underneath. The noise, the vibration will affect these neighborhoods. So it is interrelated. So as I started talking to you about Prince George's County and the city of Bowie, these are the top fair housing issues that we found. Now, that being said, I know Mr. Jesse Buggs will want me to clarify and say that a lot of these top fair housing issues were primarily for the county and not for the city of Bowie. So these top issues that I have here, these were the top 7 top fair housing issues that we found for the county that you can see here. And some of the goals that for Prince George's County, I didn't list all of them, so I just chose a few. And I would say these are probably like the top three. The first one is related to the fair housing enforcement ecosystem. The county has a human relations commission. They have been in conversation and trying to qualify and make sure that they can become a fair housing agency under HUD regulation. So they go through this process and they become what they call a fair housing agency under fair housing, the FAP as they call it in HUD speak. They will be able to undertake cases, fair housing cases directly in the county rather than having to send them to HUD and then wait for HUD to send the results back to the county. There have been some deficiencies in the county related to a settlement around persons with disabilities. This is called the Ripley Settlement. And it's basically around public access to public housing, but also the construction of new housing. And then the prioritization, finally, the prioritization of programs for funding with persons with disabilities, homeless individuals, families, and seniors. And that's something that the county has been working on, particularly with our Housing Opportunities Commission. That's been a huge discussion and priority for the county. So I think this is an area where they're able to turn it around in the next few years, hopefully. There are some other issues here related to goals related to language access, making sure that there's investments in both distressed communities and neighborhoods of opportunity, and then reconsideration of accessory dwelling unit policy, which, by the way, that's also controversial here in Montgomery County. So again, this is a reason why these conversations would be good to have on a regional basis. We're all struggling with the same questions. Accessory dwelling units are another way that a homeowner can provide housing as for maybe their elderly, elderly parent, or maybe they were once an empty nester, and then their son or daughter comes home from college because they're trying to look for a job. They can't afford the high rents in downtown DC or in the area, and they're trying to get started, or maybe just as rental income and provide a rental for a single person who's also trying to can't find an affordable rental unit and wants to live in a neighborhood of high opportunity. For the city of Bowie, the two goals that we chose here is part of it is to continue to increase awareness for fair housing rights and responsibilities through fair housing education programs like the one that we're doing today. And then I think this is one of the more exciting ones, is this opportunity to implement a moderately priced dwelling unit or inclusionary housing program. This has been a goal. The city of Bowie has been able to negotiate through development agreements some moderately priced dwellings as part of some developments that are ongoing as a pilot. But I know they're considering, so we'll have to wait for Mr. Jesse Buggs to tell us where that's at. I haven't talked to him in a while about, but I know this was a goal of the department. So I'm going to stop right there and just give a moment to talk about the AI for the city of Bowie and Prince George's County. Jesse, do you have any comments? And Kay, are there any questions in the chat?
We just have one participant thanking us for the thoughtful and informative presentation.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Again, if anyone has comments or questions, even if it's not directly related to the presentation related to housing and housing policy, feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand.
Manuel, I wanted to provide an update, just as you said, just to let them know that the MPDU program that we are currently designing as a result of negotiations with Melford, which is a major development within the city. They're going to build approximately 2,000 units of housing over there. And we have an agreement with them to place 5% of all the rental units under our newly designed MPDU program. And we've been able to do that as a pilot and are currently negotiating something similar with a new development coming up called South Lake, where they're building approximately 1,000 new units at the intersections of 301 and Central Avenue. So progress is being made. It will represent the first time and only municipality in the county to ever have such an agreement. So we're hopeful that that program will work out. I also just wanted to make a personal note that the person who made the comment in the chat, Monica Best James, is the legal counsel for the Prince George's County Council. So we welcome her and thank her for the comment.
Thank you, much appreciated. And that's very exciting. So that's going to represent a lot of new, moderately priced, affordable workforce units in the city. So that's great. A lot of new housing. We certainly need it in the region. That's for sure. And you know, something that we've been involved in the conversation, and just a little bit, just on a personal note. So I've been working on fair housing since probably since around 2014 time period. So with all the changes, the Supreme Court case, I was working at Enterprise Community Partners at the time, and one of the goals that the region had, or it was something that all the regional housing directors started talking about, is the whole notion of a regional analysis of impediments. So working together as a region, that's something that is ongoing. Jesse is very active among the group of housing directors in the area. Jesse, if I remember, I think you were chair of the housing directors at COG for a period of time, and helped to shepherd this conversation where we are today. So this whole compact that now exists, this agreement to have a regional analysis of impediments, is thanks in part to many of Mr. Buggs's efforts. So it's taken a lot of negotiation. It took several years to come up with an agreement, lots of lawyers involved in the agreement and what that looks like. And so after many years, they have agreed to conduct a joint AI. Now, mind you, a lot of the other obstacles also had to do with the changes in the rule. It's like, do we have an assessment of fair housing rule or not? Are we going to have the tools or not? Who's in, who's out? How are we going to pay for it? So it took a lot of doing, and the end result is that it's going to include the District of Columbia, Montgomery County in Maryland and Arlington, Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, and the city of Alexandria in Virginia. And it's tricky because each jurisdiction has to conduct their own analysis of impediments, their own document, their own community engagement, but we're also going to do that, come together as a region, compare notes, see where there are some commonalities, see where there are some goals that we can join together. And the process is going to take probably a year to a year and a half. I think the goal is to have a draft by this coming September or October to discuss, and then into the next year they would have a complete AI that can be presented. And on that project team, I'm going to be working with the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights under law. They are very experienced in conducting analysis of impediments across the country, and very knowledgeable on all the rules, as well as the Urban Institute, which many of you know. They're great on the data front, so I'm very excited about working with them. And there are going to be lots of maps and lots of information to kind of like geek out if you're into that kind of thing, and lots of information to kind of learn from. And I think that's partly what we want to do from that too, is see how we can eat all of the jurisdictions in this, for example, this example about accessory dwelling units. What does that look like, and what is the impact, and how can we have a policy across the region or a goal? And I wanted to bring to your attention a couple of examples, and I think it's just by pure luck and coincidence, hopefully, or maybe just that we live in a very active mid-Atlantic region, because regional analysis of impediments are a high bar. They're very hard to do, as you can see, just trying to get local governments to agree. But we have an example to our south in Richmond, which is currently in the draft phase of their regional analysis of impediments. And then Baltimore to the north, which completed one a couple of years ago. So they're actually our model. And I just chose 3 examples from Richmond. There are a lot more, and if you're interested, we can send you a copy of that. In Richmond, one of the 3 goals that they have, or one of the 3 goals that I chose to highlight, strengthening the funding for eviction mediation and eviction prevention programs. You can see it's all very timely. The pandemic has just brought this all to light about the need for more help in eviction and mediation and eviction prevention programs. They're looking at a pilot program to incentivize landlords to house tenants perceived as high risk. And we know this from before, so this is similar, related to source of income discrimination. It's not just that they won't accept a housing choice voucher, but that, you know, smaller private landlords, I've heard this in communities time after time, are turned off, and they think that you know, a tenant is going to go in and tear in their rental unit, and that these people are perceived as high risk because they have some kind of a record, and it might, you know, it might just be like some kind of a misdemeanor, has nothing to do with how they might behave or take care of a home. But this takes units that could be available from the housing stock. So this is a good initiative. The other one that they're looking at piloting is a rental rehabilitation program for small landlords. And this is to help them fix up. A lot of the smaller landlords can't afford to do a lot of the rehabilitation. So in exchange for fixing up their building, their small multifamily building, they would also agree to keep those units affordable to 60% of the area median income. So really a workforce kind of housing. In Baltimore, they're looking at agreeing to preserve expiring affordable housing units. Many of you may recall the property Section 8 program, and you know, the project-based Section 8. And back in the day, the federal government provided a subsidy to landlords and developers if they kept certain units at an affordable rate. And so basically, instead of a voucher where a person can go, or family can go search for their housing unit anywhere, these were specific units in specific places. Well, here we are 20 or 30 years later, and many of these units are expiring. The contract is up. The landlord is able to go to market and change those units and fix them up and put them at market rate, which is great for them. But then that's also the loss of housing, perhaps in a great neighborhood that is turned around. So that's been a big issue in Baltimore and across the country. Baltimore has also been involved in different lawsuits across the over the years. There was a big case called Gautreaux about the use of the Section 8 voucher, and there were many limitations that were placed on that. And so that's still a work in progress. So they're looking at developing, and this case took place like maybe 25, 30 years ago, at least that much. But in any case, it is sometimes hard to use the voucher across the county. And so they want to make it easier across county lines. And so they're looking at easing those procedures. And then Baltimore also wants to ask the state, who controls the tax credit program, to look at their tax credit allocation plan so that there are more family units that are built in areas of opportunity. What we find in a lot of times in affordable housing is that neighborhoods, you know, the NIMBYism, people are okay with units for seniors and elderly, but then you want to put family units, and people cause a ruckus, and there are all sorts of perceptions, misperceptions, and stereotypes about people who live in affordable housing that unfortunately take place. So we are currently in the community engagement process. We have started that whole process. Our team is meeting with the various counties and setting up meetings to just tell people that the regional AI is happening. There'll be also the opportunity for the more formal presentations and meetings for each jurisdictions fair housing plan, and then the regional plan will take place. We are teaming up with Challenging Racism, which is a excellent nonprofit that started out on school boundary issues in Arlington. And they have really been a leader in helping to have conversations about race and equity and racial justice, and having it take place in a meaningful way, in a more localized way. So we're going to have some regional events. We're going to have 3 regional events starting in the summer. And this will be a great way to hear from local voices and the impact of segregation and racial injustice in our region, and try to be forward looking too. So that's the whole idea. We want to be forward looking. We want people to be engaged in this process for the regional AI. We want new groups and new voices to take part. A lot of times it's usually the same usual suspects that take place in these meetings. And you know, housing affordability is something that is of interest to all of us and across our region. So we hope to new voices and new people will become engaged. And I'll just end with this, one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King. I know that it's been a very difficult year for so many reasons. And but this quote really speaks to me about how, you know, maybe our time period, we wish that things would happen more quickly and they don't. But as he well put it here, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, and that's what we're all working toward. So I also put here the information for the regional AI. COG has a website. It's at www.mwcog.org/fair housing. We also have a fair housing email. And then finally, this is my information. So after today, if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, please feel free to email me. And I thank you for the opportunity to present, and I'm happy to open it up for questions, conversations with Jesse, okay, and the rest of you. So thank you.
Manuel, I know that we have a spot here for a 10-minute break, but in lieu of that, given the time that you have taken to present to us and have completed your presentation, we can just see if we have any questions or comments at this time that we can respond to. And if not, then we can move forward toward closing out this presentation, this 2021 Fair Housing Symposium today. So let's see if we have any questions or comments in the chat. Kay, do you want to see what we have and shepherd us through this part of the process?
At the moment, there are no comments or questions. As always, everyone, if you want to make a comment, you can type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. If you have any questions for me or Jesse about the grants office and what we do for the city of Bowie, we're also happy to answer questions about that. No comments.
I have a question for you, Jesse, just to kind of see what is happening in the plans for the city and the county. I know some of that has been through the state on the funding that's going to be available to pay rents through the American Rescue Plan, the rental stabilization program.
Yeah, so we have, like all other county cities in the region, received funding from the initial CARES Act. In the recent legislation, only the state and certain counties receive funds, and as part of that process, Prince George's County received approximately $27 million to assist with paying arrearages for rent. And then the state gave them an additional $27 million. So that is the pool, almost, 54, closer to $60 million they have on hand to help pay for rent for residents. And their program is geared almost exclusively to having landlords apply for those funds. But they open another window or portal to allow individuals, for those landlords who either did not want to apply for their tenants, or there were some other complications. So the county has approximately $60 million to pay. We are about to, in the city, have a smaller amount left over from the previous CARES Act that we will be rolling out in the next 2 to 3 months for our residents. We did before about $200,000, and now we're getting ready to do another $150,000 within the next 3 or 4 months. So we're all participating. We all have programs that are up and running, and that is a major problem for all of us. And as you said earlier, you know, there are a number of things that landlords are doing that are putting tenants at risk of being evicted, and they haven't stopped filing the court cases. And in the state of Maryland, the CDC's mandates are not working as an impediment to the filings. And in fact, what the law says is that tenants can use these the CDC ruling and the governor's proclamations as a defense. And a lot of tenants don't know that, and they are still being evicted, and a lot of problems are still taking place. So we have a lot of things we need to do to educate tenants and educate residents. You know, we have a lot of single family homes where we have renters. And so there are a lot of issues, and across a county this size, you know, there are a lot of people that need the attention. So while there's money, there's still the law, there's still the courts, and there's still the processes, and there's still tenants that need to be educated about all of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big concern, because it would be a tragedy that there's all this money available that someone could use to pay their back rent, and that they'll still be evicted and lose their home. So hopefully we'll be able to catch up with that. But I thought it was important to talk about this, because I do think that after the fact there will be some fair housing cases related to that. You know, if it can be shown that certain groups of renters are being evicted at a higher rate, if there is a disparate impact, so to speak, on the kinds of renters that are being targeted, there could certainly be some fair housing cases there. But of course, what we would prefer is that the people actually stay in their home, and we can avoid all of that, and not lose their unit and be thrown out into the street. So but I thought this was an important point, because that's how it intersects, how something today that's happening today that is top of mind intersects with the Fair Housing Act.
And it also points to why we need this regional alliance and approach to how we help solve these problems across the entire COG region, because we're all dealing with the same thing. So for those of us who have these responsibilities in our jurisdiction, we really do need to work with each other for best practices and lessons learned, so that we can help the people that we are employed or hired to make sure that they can stay in their homes comfortably. This is a very difficult time through this pandemic period, and even though we're coming out of it, we all know that we have at least another 18 to 24 months of dealing with the fallout from what we've gone through.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys.
Okay.
For the discussion. I was gonna say we do have one comment in the chat asking if the presentation will be made available, and the answer to that is yes. I just wanted to put this slide up one more time so people could see the program website, cityofbowie.org/fairhousing. This program presentation today has been recorded, and that will be made available on that website shortly. And there's also a lot of other fair housing information available there, and we will put this slide deck that Manuel used up on the website as well. And I also, we were mentioning rental relief and COVID relief. The City of Bowie has a program website for that too. It's COB Cares, cityofbowie.org/COB Cares. That's also on this slide here. So if you want to learn more about what the city's doing regarding rental assistance as we launch those programs, you'll find that information on that website.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great.
Okay,
Very good. Well, we thank you, Manuel, for your presentation. We thank you, Kay, for organizing this, and we thank all of you for joining us today. We have a lot of work to do, and we are hopefully going to do all of that work together. So thank you all very much, and this concludes our presentation for today. Thank you all again.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon and weekend.
Okay.